Today we're going to talk about data and insights. How do you extract learnings from data? What data insights you should look at when opening a destination for domestic and international tourism? How can you reimagine tourism based on consumer insights? To talk about all that, my guest today is Donald Ong, the Vice President of Data and Services at Mastercard. So let's head over and listen to him. Welcome to crTALKS. In this series of travel readiness conversations, I'll be talking to experts, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, key stakeholders on how destinations and businesses are getting ready to resume tourism after COVID-19. Thanks for watching. I'm Fazal, your host for today. Hi, Donald. Thanks for joining our discussion today. Today, we really want to focus on the data and insights that you have gathered on the impact of COVID, specifically on ASEAN destinations. But before I do that, I really wanted to, you to describe a little bit what your team does, data and services team does within Mastercard to get us started.
Sure thing. Firstly, hi Fazal. Good to connect with you virtually. I hope you are keeping safe and sound in the comforts of your home. But sure, let's jump into it. So data and services in Mastercard. Let me describe it in a few ways. I think firstly, we have to recognize that Mastercard is a global payment network. We process over 75 billion transactions a year. That's a lot of data. That's a lot of rich insights that can come out of that data. Secondly, we are a technology company. So we build technologies ourselves or we acquire them. And technologies like platforms that helps you transform all that rich data coming out of our network into actionable insights and actionable intelligence. And we complement that with platforms like digital marketing, loyalty solutions, and those help the clients execute in the most engaging, the most contextual, and the most experiential way possible. And thirdly, as a global network, we connect consumers, we connect small and large businesses across the global footprint, right? And that means that inherently we have strong industry expertise in spaces like travel, in tourism, and of course in payment ecosystems, financial services, brick and mortar retail, as well as e-commerce. Now, what the data and services team does is that we leverage all these unique assets of ours, our data, our technology, our industry expertise. And we use all that to help our customers such as financial institutions, digital players, governments, businesses, and in the travel and tourism space, this will be airlines, OTAs, airports, retailers. And we help them make data-driven decisions and to execute effectively so that they can optimize their business outcomes. So that in a nutshell is data and services.
Wonderful, thanks. How big is the team here in Singapore?
In Singapore, well, in Asia Pacific, I think we are at least 300 strong now.
Wow, that's a big data team. Great. So tell us about, Donald, your recent research that you did on the insight and also the insights on the impact of COVID. I think you did a comprehensive research on the ASEAN destinations and also some other Asia-Pac destinations. So what was the main driver for getting into this research?
Absolutely. Fazal, I think since COVID broke out at the start of the year, there's been a lot of analysis on impact. And the primary focus has really been on the economic cost of the pandemic, the impact to GDP, the impact to different industries, and the impact to jobs, for example. But honestly, if you want to look ahead in terms of the path to recovery, then we are going to need to look at how all those things and all that impact is translating to changes in the consumer sentiment, in terms of how the pandemic has changed attitudes, how it's changed behaviors, the view of the future, right? And how this is continuing to change over time as we go through the different cycles of this pandemic. So with the impact study that we produce, you get a good sense of this across the 10 markets in Asia Pacific where we are running the study. Let me give some examples.
Yep.
So for example, the impact study looks at whether people feel safe and how concerned they are with regards to actually contracting COVID-19. Has the pandemic impacted household finances in an adverse manner?
Right.
What's their outlook ahead with regards to household finances? And how does that actually differ across different income segments, different age groups, and across the different 10 markets? The impact study also looks at how behavior has changed and how they expect it to change going forward. For example, I'm sure everybody's read a lot about the shift to digital, to cashless, to contactless, to touchless. And there are a lot of concerns towards overcrowded spaces as well.
Right.
You know, how is all that changing over time and across the 10 markets as well? And then we look at travel.
Right.
You know, as restrictions lift, how comfortable do people feel about traveling?
Right.
Is it going to be more domestic? Is it going to be cross-border? And if so, which destinations will be the top of mind? Because unlike past crises, I think the impact of this pandemic is a lot broader and is a lot deeper. It's impacting people's sense of livelihood. It's impacting habits. It's impacting choices. It's impacting decisions. And I feel many of these are going to be long-lasting even after the pandemic is gone. So therefore, understanding that change in sentiment and their sense of outlook over time, that's going to be important, firstly, as a lead indicator from a demand perspective, but also inform the broad themes for strategies on the supply side, so that service providers can really be in touch and in tune with the consumer psyche in the various different markets that they might operate in.
Great. So, I mean, Donald, can you sort of point out some insights that stood out, that surprised you, kind of, you didn't expect it to look like that?
Yeah, I did see a very strong response with regards to domestic travel and the likelihood of domestic travel. So that came out quite strongly across the board. And you see that translate in, say, a market like China, right? We saw over 55% of respondents surveyed said that when restrictions lift, they will travel domestically, and only 22% said they will travel cross-border, right? And we actually seen that play out during the Dragon Boat Festival weekend in the last week of June, which recorded over 48 million visitors. Okay.
Great. So I mean, that's the dilemma that we all are having, right? The destinations are having this dilemma. Of course, all of them sort of want to focus initially on domestic tourism, but at the same time, you have impact on the incomes of people. Household incomes have been impacted. So it's a challenge. Of course, how do you still, even if they are locals, you still have to give some level of visitor confidence to them. Safety is important. Hygiene is important. So which data points should destinations look at in terms of, making domestic tourism sort of get back to some level of normalcy?
Well, I think we touched a bit on the importance of keeping an eye on consumer sentiment and attitudes over time. So that's always going to be a good starting point to get a sense of how consumers feel about being out of home, right, to begin with, as restrictions sort of lift. And we talked about domestic tourism. Across the 10 markets that we are producing the report, there is a strong bias towards domestic travel at this point in time. And that, to me, intuitively is a very positive sign, because that's a high percentage of consumers actually wanting to fulfill their travel itches. They are actually saying they are comfortable being out of home and doing that, okay? Now, I think once you have a good sense of the sentiment on the ground, then I think the next step will be to start looking at specific segments and generating hypotheses there to be tested, right? For example, we could actually look at consumers that were, say, frequent travelers pre-COVID and look at their behavior now, where as restrictions lift, we might see some are a lot more comfortable than others in terms of going out, in terms of spending in discretionary categories like retail shopping, restaurants, or entertainment. So data can actually help you flesh that out, right? To determine the segments that have a relatively higher propensity for domestic travel. And then you can develop hypotheses to be tested. Number one, to maximize domestic travel, right? Because that's the opportunity at hand. And then number two, to build engagement towards cross-border travel as the corridors open up.
Right. I mean, how about the demographics? Is there something to look at from a demographic point? Are younger people more sort of, I mean, there's this general sort of perception that younger people are less risk averse, maybe they probably would maybe the first ones to travel. Does your insights give, that level of insights in, what demographics may be first to sort of get on their, on road trips and adventures within the country?
Yeah, the impact study definitely has some insight on how different age groups and different income segments feel, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a current perspective and a forward-looking perspective. But I think, that's only going to give you broad themes to think about. If you really want to maximize during this point in time, I think it's important to figure out what hypotheses that you're going to test and what actually is going to work and what won't work, right? Yes. Between the different segments that you mentioned. Because that old playbook that people used to, apply for travel and tourism, that's not going to work anymore. Everybody's going to need to try new things. They need to be innovative. They need to reimagine the whole tourist journey and the whole experience. And you see a lot of operators out there starting out with propositions that gives you a sense of space, mm-hmm. right? A lot of hygiene measures to provide assurances that everything is safe from a health perspective. But there's a lot of cost in that, and there's a lot of friction in that. And where is that point of diminishing return, right? How much is actually overkill, and what is really optimal from a cost-benefit perspective? And if you don't know that, how do you sort of invest at scale across your business, right? So I think data capabilities like test and learn, those become really important because those help you isolate out all those noise as you conduct those tests and experiments. It helps you measure and understand the true impact of that action and what are the key variables sort of driving that impact. And when you can do that with a high degree of precision, then you have clarity and certainty on what's working now and what's not in the different segments. And that lets you act with confidence to apply it across your business to get the same cause and effect and maximize the impact. Okay?
Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just about to share an example. So we are working with an airline to test strategies on the presentation of meals,
right?
With changes like serving meals with mini bottles of condiments and ketchup that has never been opened before.
Okay.
But all that has a cost to it, right? So on one hand, you want to make it more presentable, you want it to be more hygienic, but there's a heavy cost to that. So what our test and learn platform helps the client do is that to determine what aspects of that configuration is making a positive impact from a client engagement perspective, and which aspects are less impactful, and reach and arrive at a configuration that sort of has the best ROI.
Okay. Right.
And our data and services teams, they are doing this with several businesses in the tourism space, helping them with our data capabilities to sort of embed an always-on test and learn approach to chart their path to growth.
The question is, data is so crucial, especially in this kind of a situation that we are facing. So how often, are you going to sort of release or test the consumer behavioral changes going forward?
So as far as the sentiment reports are concerned, I think we've issued 2 so far, and we plan to have another one in September, if not earlier. So the field work is happening now. And the idea is across the 3 series, you could see sort of the evolution and the change in attitudes and behavior, right? But like I said, those helps to, the sentiment reports help to inform sort of broad themes to think about. And then, we have to work with clients to figure out things to test out, right? As the opportunities emerge.
All right. So, we talked a little bit about the domestic tourism part, from an ASEAN perspective, a lot of people don't realize, of course, from a numbers perspective, domestic tourism is a pretty large portion of the ASEAN tourism segment, which is what everybody's sort of now, of course, it's low yield, but then you need numbers anyway. So let's move a little bit on to intra-ASEAN, because we think also that intra-ASEAN is crucial to at least get the ASEAN region back to some level of confidence.
Absolutely.
So what data points should we look at when, if destinations are looking at, when do we start, of course, Singapore, Malaysia just announced yesterday that they're opening the borders for some level of travel. But, as destinations, which data points should they look at in terms of opening up intra-ASEAN travel?
From the impact reports, we see that in most of the ASEAN markets, actually the majority said that they will travel domestically for vacation as restrictions lift, of course, but there was a sizable percentage that said that they will travel overseas as well, and especially intra-region. As an example, 32% of the Thais that were surveyed said that they are likely to plan a trip overseas for leisure, and Singapore was a top destination for them. And vice versa, over 50% of Singaporeans that were surveyed said that they are likely to plan a trip overseas, and Thailand was the top destination, right? So you're absolutely right. I think the demand for intra-region tourism is going to be hugely popular. And intuitively, that makes sense, right? Because as an initial preference towards short-haul destinations, and for whatever reason, whether it's a precautionary behavior or for economical reasons, as the impacts studies do indicate, that COVID has taken a toll on household finances, especially in the ASEAN markets, and they expect this to continue for a period of time. In my view, the shift in preference for intra-regional travel, I think that's a huge opportunity for a lot of the markets here to start thinking about winning those tourism dollars that are available that were previously going to other regions.
Okay? Absolutely.
Of course, this also means that the profile of visitors are actually more regional. So service providers, operators, they are going to need to start looking at the data as well to understand those personas deeply and the changes in the personas that they are dealing with now, so that they can develop compelling propositions that resonate with this new set of target population. And then they need to start testing them out, right? Testing the strategies out, extract the learnings very quickly, look at what's working, what's not, and sort of strive towards maximizing the spend per visit, okay? Ideally, you want to reach a point where a visitor spends as much as they did when they had visited outside of ASEAN. I think that is what you want to strive for, and you want to sort of take a data-driven approach to test different ways and see whether you're getting there.
When do you see them coming back to the region? What enablers do we need to have for them to get back to the region?
Well, I would also encourage to look at the same starting point in terms of the sentiments of consumers outside of ASEAN, right? Because as those countries look at travel bubbles, right? The specific corridors that are being worked up from a bilateral perspective, how are those consumers in those corridors feel? How do they feel about being out of home? Firstly, how are they embracing domestic tourism within their market to begin with? I think those are important lead indicators to begin with, okay? Yeah, and the sentiment is going to differ across the markets because the severity of COVID has been different across the markets. So the attitudes and the behavior, that's going to be very different as well. So understanding that and understanding why, I think that's going to be important so that you can build corridor-specific strategies and sort of configure those strategies in a way that speaks and resonates with the attitudes and behaviors that you are seeing and the preferences that you are seeing from those originating markets, okay? In some cases, you might need to over-index on safety and health, my apologies. And in other cases, other aspects may be more important, right?
Right.
For example, in the US, one thing we are seeing is that domestic tourism coming back up again, but the nature is oriented towards a very distributed sort of experience that are off the beaten path. Camping experiences, I think that's gaining in popularity. Road trips, that's suddenly risen sharply as well. So understanding this sort of data points and nuances by origin markets, I think that's going to be important to help ASEAN countries and the operators sort of prepare and position themselves to be more attractive and more preferred from a destination standpoint for the travelers in sort of a post-pandemic environment.
Great. Just a couple of more, questions for you, Donald. Thanks for your time. ASEAN's main inbound tourism comes from almost about 4 or 5 or 6 destinations out there. It's China, it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia,
India and US, so the 8 destinations. But I think the opportunity probably for ASEAN is East Asia initially, which is China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. And I know that your impact reports covered those destinations as well. How was the impact? I think, my understanding was their household income impact was not as large as in the ASEAN destinations itself.
Yes, I think that was a bit of a difference in the sense that the ASEAN respondents were less pessimistic, I would say, in terms of their economic circumstances, both the current impact and what they expect going forward. So that's a good sign for, I think, inbound to ASEAN, right? And we do see those markets stabilize and normalize from a COVID curve perspective, and that's another encouraging sign as well. So I would say, that's a great starting point to understand those sentiments of those consumers within those markets and start crafting sort of corridor-specific strategies. And as I said earlier, find ways to make yourself the most preferred destination and make yourself attractive, more so than the other countries that are opening up. I think that is the challenge, right?
Right. Okay, thanks, Donald. One last question. It's the most difficult one for you. Are you ready for it, Donald?
Of course. I'm a little bit scared, but go ahead.
When do you think travel will get back to the 2019 levels in ASEAN?
Oh, Fazal, I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't. But I am optimistic, right? There's a lot of efforts on the vaccine front. There's a lot of innovation on bilateral arrangements on corridor bubbles. Consumers are as well itching to travel.
True.
So I think there is demand on a long-term basis, right? I think definitely we will get back to the 2019 levels. When is the question, I suppose, right? But I'm sorry, I don't have a magic.
You don't have a crystal ball with you currently. That's great. One last question, a fun question. Which place would you like to go to as soon as it's opened up? You personally, if you want to, for a holiday.
Personally, I would actually ASEAN, right? ASEAN countries. So Thailand, Malaysia. I think those will be my top priorities.
Okay.
As soon as they become available. Yeah. And there are ways you can these days you can book advance. There's flexible cancellation terms. Absolutely. And the operators, they've really become quite innovative as well during this time, right?
True.
You can book ahead. You have flexible cancellation. I think a lot of the highly sought after hotels or properties that you previously couldn't get, right? Because it's so hard to sort after. You actually now can book. So yeah, I have pent up demand, so I'm looking forward to travel.
Yeah, I was told that there are some offers which are like make a booking now, travel anytime within the next 12 months, and cancel at any time. So I mean,
exactly.
You can't get better than that.
Exactly.
Thanks, Donald. And is there anything else that you want to share before we close? Thanks a lot for sharing all your insights. And of course, we have put together a report with Mastercard, which includes some of the work that you have done with the work that we have done as well. So it'll be available to stakeholders to get better idea of what they can do in travel and tourism. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we close the call?
No, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for the opportunity. And yes, I look forward to continued collaboration going forward.
Thank you, Donald. Thanks for your time, and I wish you all the best.
You too.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching crTALKS. In the next episodes, we will be talking to more travel industry stakeholders on how they are overcoming challenges to rebuild the travel industry. So join us on our next episodes. Until then, goodbye.